Whispering House seemingly stared at the faded photograph in her hand, a single drop of sweat trailing down her temple. The house in the picture loomed like a shadowed memory, a decrepit Victorian manor at the edge of the small town of Black Hollow. Her late grandmother had left it to her in the will, and though she had reservations, Emily couldn't resist the lure of its mysterious history. When she arrived, the house was exactly as it had been in the photo. Ivy clawed at the cracked walls, and the windows seemed to glare at her like hollow eyes. Her footsteps crunched on the gravel as she approached, the air turning colder with every step. Something about the place felt alive. The townsfolk had whispered tales of the house for years. Some claimed it was cursed, others said it was haunted by the spirits of its previous occupants. But Emily, a skeptic at heart, dismissed their warnings as small-town superstition. As she pushed open the creaking front door, a gust of stale air rushed out to greet her. The interior was dim, even though it was midday. Dust motes floated in the air, and the scent of mildew lingered like a warning. Emily set down her suitcase in the grand foyer and looked around. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint creaking of old wood. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, stretching unnaturally across the floor. She shook off the unease and began exploring. The parlor was filled with antique furniture covered in white sheets, like ghostly figures frozen in time. A grand chandelier hung precariously above, its crystals dulled with age. In the kitchen, she found a dusty journal on the counter. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with time. Intrigued, she opened it, finding entries written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. They whisper at night, soft at first, then louder. I can't sleep. The walls are alive. I swear it. The entry was dated over a century ago. Emily felt a chill creep up her spine but brushed it off. Surely it was just the ramblings of someone who had lived a lonely life in this isolated house. As night fell, Emily decided to stay in the master bedroom upstairs. The bed was large and sturdy, though the mattress sagged in the middle. She lit a candle she'd brought with her, its flickering flame casting long shadows on the walls. Lying in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. She tried to convince herself it was just the house settling. Then she heard it, a faint whisper. Emily froze, her heart pounding. It was soft, almost indistinct, but unmistakably a whisper. Get out! She sat up, clutching the blanket tightly. Hello, she called out, her voice trembling. No response, only silence. Minutes passed, and Emily convinced herself she'd imagined it. But just as she began to relax, the whisper came again, louder this time. You shouldn't be here. A panic surged through her. She grabbed the candle and bolted out of the bedroom, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She made her way downstairs, her mind racing. As she reached the floor, she stopped abruptly. The front door, which she had locked, was now wide open, swaying slightly in the cold night air. Emily's rational mind screamed at her to leave, but a strange compulsion kept her rooted to the spot. It was as if the house was daring her to stay, to uncover its secrets. She slammed the door shut and turned to face the darkness. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice wavering. The house seemed to laugh in response. The whispering grew louder, coming from all around her now. Words she couldn't understand filled the air, overlapping and chaotic. Desperate for answers, Emily remembered the journal. She ran back to the kitchen and flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. One entry caught her eye. The whispers come from beneath. They are trapped, but they want out. God help anyone who sets them free. A sudden thud echoed through the house, making Emily jump. It came from the basement. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to leave. But curiosity, or perhaps the house itself, drove her forward. She found the door to the basement and opened it. A damp, musty smell wafted up, and the staircase descended into pitch blackness. Clutching her candle tightly, Emily began her descent. The stairs groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, the candle's light revealed a dirt floor and stone walls. Old crates and rusted tools were scattered around, but what caught her attention was a trapdoor in the center of the room. It was padlocked, the metal tarnished with age. Scratches marred the wood, as if someone or something had tried to claw its way out. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around her like a sinister symphony. "Don't open it." But Emily was compelled. She found a crowbar among the tools and pried the lock loose. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a dark void below. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. A cold draft emanated from the hole, carrying with it the scent of decay. Emily peered inside, her candle barely illuminating the edges. Then she saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. They blinked in unison, and a low growl rumbled from the depths. Emily stumbled back, dropping the candle. Darkness engulfed her, and the growl turned into a deafening roar. She ran blindly up the stairs, the sound of something climbing after her filling her ears. She reached the foyer and fumbled with the front door, finally wrenching it open. The moment she stepped outside, the noise stopped. She turned to look back, and the house was silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Emily fled to her car and drove until the house was nothing but a memory in her rearview mirror. But the whispers never left her. Even miles away, in the safety of her apartment, she could still hear them at night. You set them free, and she knew, deep down, that they were coming for her. The whispers of Blackwood Forest was an eerie place, its tall, ancient trees casting shadows even on the brightest days. Locals in the nearby town of Ravenhill spoke in hushed tones about the forest, warning travelers to avoid it at all costs. They spoke of strange whispers carried on the wind, of people who had ventured in and never returned. For decades, Blackwood was a place of fear, a forbidden zone. But to Amy, it was a challenge. Amy, a budding journalist fresh out of college, had grown tired of writing puff pieces for the local paper. She wanted a real story, something that would propel her career forward. When she overheard a group of townsfolk talking about the forest, she knew she had found her story. The whispers of Blackwood weren't just campfire tales, she thought. They were a mystery waiting to be unraveled. Amy parked her car at the edge of the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon. She grabbed her flashlight, camera, and a notebook. The forest loomed before her, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. A shiver ran down her spine, but she shook it off. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "It's just trees." The first hour in the forest was uneventful. The path was overgrown but manageable, and apart from the occasional rustle of leaves, it was quiet. Too quiet. Amy paused to jot down her thoughts, her pen scratching against the paper. That's when she heard a faint whisper. Her head snapped up. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Just the wind. She laughed nervously. "Get it together, Amy." But as she continued deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices just out of reach. She couldn't make out the words, but they sent chills down her spine. Amy stopped and turned on her camera, pointing it into the darkness. The beam of her flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but trees. "Who's there?" she demanded. The whispers stopped. Silence. Then, a low, guttural growl. Amy spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. She shone her flashlight into the trees, and for a split second, she thought she saw a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes. And then it was gone. Amy's instincts told her to turn back, but her pride wouldn't let her. She had come for a story, and she wasn't leaving without one. She pressed on, her every step echoing in the oppressive silence. The path eventually led her to a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Vines snaked up its walls, and the windows were dark and lifeless. Amy hesitated. The cabin felt wrong, like it didn't belong. Still, she approached. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the still night. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like curtains. Amy stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room. A table sat in the center, its surface covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. A mirror hung crooked on the far wall, its glass cracked and foggy. She raised her camera and began taking pictures, documenting every detail. As she moved deeper into the cabin, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more distinct. "Amy." She froze. The voice had spoken her name. Her flashlight flickered, plunging her into darkness for a heartbeat before the light returned. In the mirror, she saw a flash of movement, a pale face staring back at her, its eyes hollow and black. Amy screamed and stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the floor. When she looked up again, the face was gone.
Panic set in. Amy grabbed her flashlight and bolted out of the cabin, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop running until she was back on the overgrown path. But the forest wasn't the same. The trees seemed closer, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The path twisted and turned, leading her in circles. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic. "Amy, Amy, Amy." She clamped her hands over her ears, but the voices were inside her head now, crawling into her mind like insects. "Stop!" she screamed. "Leave me alone." Laughter erupted from the darkness, cold and mocking.
Amy tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping her palms. She scrambled to her feet, her flashlight illuminating a tree trunk. Carved into the bark was a single word: run. She didn't need to be told twice. Amy ran blindly, her legs burning and her lungs screaming for air. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth with no escape. Shadows danced around her, and the whispers gave way to screams piercing, inhuman shrieks that made her ears ring. Then she saw a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through her as she sprinted toward it. The light led her to another clearing, but instead of safety, she found a circle of stones surrounding a gaping hole in the ground. The air around it was heavy, vibrating with an unnatural energy. Amy approached the edge cautiously, peering into the darkness. The whispers were coming from the hole, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be calling her. "Amy." She stumbled back, her heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" she shouted. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the whispers grew deafening. Shadows poured out of the hole, swirling around her like a living storm. They took on shapes, twisted, grotesque forms with glowing eyes and jagged teeth. Amy backed away, her flashlight shaking in her hands. She tripped over one of the stones and fell, her head striking the ground. When she opened her eyes, the forest was silent. The whispers were gone, and the shadows had vanished. Amy sat up, her head throbbing. The clearing was empty, the hole now covered by a thick layer of roots and earth. It was as if it had never been there. She staggered to her feet and made her way back to the car, her steps slow and unsteady. The forest seemed less menacing now, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When she finally reached her car, she collapsed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. As she started the engine, she glanced in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, a pair of hollow, black eyes stared back at her. The last thing she heard was a whisper, "Amy." The next morning, the townsfolk found Amy's car abandoned at the edge of Blackwood Forest. Her camera and notebook were still inside, but there was no sign of her. The only clue was a single word scratched into the car's windshield: whispers. The legend of Blackwood Forest grew that day, and Amy's story became just another chapter in its dark history. Whispering Shadows. The night was unseasonably cold for mid-October, and the small town of Ravenswood slumbered beneath a blanket of mist. Beyond the last flickering streetlight, where the forest grew thick and dark, stood an abandoned manor. It had been uninhabited for decades, its windows like empty eyes watching the world outside. Locals called it Blackthorn House, a name spoken only in hushed tones. For most, the manor was a relic of the past, a place to avoid. But for Clara, it was an opportunity. A freelance journalist with a penchant for chasing the macabre, she had stumbled upon stories about the house while researching a piece on local urban legends. Strange disappearances, whispers in the dark, shadows that moved when no one was there. The kind of tales perfect for her portfolio. Clara pulled her car to the edge of the forest, just shy of the dirt road leading to the manor. The engine sputtered off, leaving her in silence. The cold gnawed at her through her jacket, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. She glanced at her watch, 11:47 p.m. Plenty of time to explore before dawn. Her flashlight cut through the mist as she stepped onto the dirt path. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself wanted her to turn back. Yet, curiosity pushed her forward. When the manor came into view, it was even more foreboding than she'd imagined. Ivy strangled its walls, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Clara hesitated, her journalistic bravado faltering for the first time. Get a grip, she thought. It's just an old house. She stepped inside. The air inside was damp and reeked of mildew. Her flashlight swept across peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and a grand staircase that seemed to groan under its own weight. As she moved deeper, the house felt unnervingly alive, its silence oppressive, as though it were listening. In the dining room, a massive oak table stood, its surface scarred with deep gouges. Clara traced one of the marks with her fingers, noting how deliberate it seemed, almost like a symbol. A sudden click-clack echoed from upstairs. She froze. Hello? Her voice wavered, swallowed by the vast emptiness. Silence. Heart pounding. Clara steeled herself and ascended the staircase. The old wood protested under her weight, each creak a sharp reminder of her vulnerability. At the top, a long hallway stretched before her, lined with doors. Most were shut tight, but one at the far end was ajar, a faint light spilling through. She approached cautiously, every nerve in her body screaming to turn back. As she nudged the door open, the flashlight illuminated a child's room. Dust-covered toys were scattered across the floor, and a small bed sat in the corner, its sheets undisturbed. But what caught her attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was large and ornate, its gilded frame incongruously pristine. Clara's reflection stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed. As she moved closer, she noticed something else in the glass, a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, flashlight slicing through the empty room. Nothing. But when she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was closer. A whisper brushed her ear, faint but unmistakable. Leave. Panic clawed at her throat. Clara stumbled back, tripping over a toy and landing hard on the wooden floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the house. She scrambled to her feet and bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She had to leave. Whatever story she thought she'd find here wasn't worth it. But as she reached the top of the staircase, her flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed her. Clara's scream caught in her throat as it lunged. She darted into the nearest room, slamming the door behind her. Her hands shook as she barricaded it with an old chair. The creature pounded against the door, the wood splintering with each hit. Clara's gaze darted around the room, desperate for an escape. Her flashlight illuminated a trapdoor in the floor. With no time to think, she yanked it open and climbed down into the darkness. The air below was damp and suffocating, the smell of earth and rot overwhelming. Clara landed in a narrow tunnel, the walls lined with ancient stone. The pounding above stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. She crept forward, the tunnel sloping downward. Her flashlight revealed strange markings on the walls, symbols carved deep into the stone. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. The air grew colder with each step, her breath visible in the beam of light. The tunnel ended in a cavernous chamber. At its center stood an altar, and atop it lay a leather-bound book. The room pulsed with a malevolent energy, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter. Clara hesitated, but her curiosity won out. She approached the altar and opened the book.
The pages were filled with drawings of twisted figures, rituals, and symbols she didn't understand. But one thing was clear, the house wasn't just haunted, it was a conduit, a gateway to something far worse. A chilling laugh echoed through the chamber, and Clara's flashlight flickered. She turned to see the shadowy figure from the mirror, now fully formed. Its face was featureless, save for a jagged mouth that stretched impossibly wide. Welcome, it hissed. The symbols on the walls flared, and Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. Shadows poured from every corner, swirling around her. She screamed as they closed in, their whispers deafening. When Clara's vision cleared, she was back in the manor, lying on the floor of the dining room. The book was gone, and the symbols were nowhere to be seen. For a moment, she thought it might have been a dream until she saw the mirror. Her reflection stared back, but it wasn't her. The eyes were wrong, too dark and too empty. The jagged smile that spread across its face wasn't hers. Clara backed away, but the reflection stayed, watching, grinning. A new whisper filled the air, soft and mocking. Asterisk, you're part of the story now. Asterisk, the front door creaked open, and the cold wind howled through the house. Clara ran, but as she stepped outside, the forest was gone. The manor stood alone in a vast expanse of darkness, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Clara realized with a sinking dread that she hadn't escaped. She never would. Ravenswood awoke the next morning to find Clara's abandoned car at the edge of the forest. The townsfolk whispered of Blackthorn House, of the journalist who had gone looking for a story and became one herself. And at night, if you stood near the forest's edge, you could hear the whispers. They always said the same thing. Asterisk, come closer, asterisk.